Hello, and thank you for joining the second live chat in our 2020 series about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. My name is Jessica Soul, and I'm the Recruitment Director for the S&T Policy Fellowships. I'll be the moderator for today's chat. Today, we're joined by fellows Allison Truhlar, Antoinette Nelson, and Aubrey Paris. We will spend the majority of our chat hearing from our fellows. Before we dive into that conversation, I have a few housekeeping points. The 2020 live chat series will feature one chat each month of the application season. Each chat is an opportunity for you to ask fellows your questions. You can register for one, some, or all of the chats. And if you missed our May chat, you can watch that recording on demand. Today's webinar topic is insider tips on the application and interview process. We want to tailor today's conversation to the topics that are of most interest to you. To do this, we'll ask you a few questions during the chat. Please respond to the questions as they appear on your screen. And we'll start now with our first question. Which of these elements of the application and interview process are you hoping we focus on during the chat? All right, thank you everybody for responding. Wow, okay, it looks like we have some pretty even balance, but a lot of interest in candidate statements and also selecting program areas in the policy memo. So these items are definitely standing out, and we'll use them to guide our conversation on these topics. We're going to be covering a lot of information in the next hour. You don't need to take notes unless you would like to, because a recording of this live chat will be sent to you tomorrow and will also be available on our website, AAAS.org/STPF. Now, in case you haven't heard, the application is open and will close on Friday, November 1st. We have a second question for you now to help us learn a little bit more about who's joining. We're curious. Do you plan to apply to the fellowship? And thank you to everybody who is joining. We're hoping you can take a second to let us know a little bit more about whether you're planning to apply to the fellowship. Wow, okay, thank you everybody for sharing these responses. I see folks who have started their application. I hope that this session gives you some insights into your materials. And for those of you who are planning to apply this year but haven't started yet, I hope that this gives you some inspiration to go ahead and click apply. And then for those of you who are maybe a few years away from applying, it's never too soon to be thinking about a policy fellowship, and you'll hear from today's panelists about what they were doing before the fellowship to become competitive as an applicant. And then for those of you who just still aren't sure or just curious, we're really glad that you can join and hear from Alison, Antoinette, and Aubrey about their experiences. So I'm curious, before you received an invitation to this webinar, I wonder how many of you had heard of AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or perhaps about the journal Science. AAAS is a nonprofit scientific society and the publisher of the journal Science. AAAS's mission is to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. AAAS and its members contribute to science diplomacy, STEM education, science policy, and much more. And it's really easy to see why this Science Policy Fellowship has its home at AAAS. A few quick reminders. The S&T Policy Fellowships are an opportunity for doctoral level scientists, social scientists, and engineers to spend a year contributing their expertise to federal policy. Applicants with a master's in engineering plus 3 years of professional engineering experience are also eligible to apply. You must be a U.S. citizen and cannot be a full-time federal employee when you apply. These positions are available in all 3 branches of the federal government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. We also have a Revell Fellowship that allows a Revell Fellow to potentially serve in a nonprofit organization as well. This is a full-time commitment in Washington, D.C., and applicants who apply in 2020 are applying for a position in the fellowship class that runs September 1st of 2021 through August 31st of 2022. Now, I do want to note that 2021 and 2022 can seem a ways away, and no one knows what the world will look like next year, let alone next month. A lot will continue to change between now and then. STPF is vigilant about keeping fellows and their families safe. The incoming class who is set to arrive this fall is strong, and the incoming class has no decline in numbers over previous years. For future applicants, all eligibility requirements and deadlines will remain in place and can be found on our website. We'll also share them with you later. We will keep applicants who then become candidates and ultimately fellow finalists up to date throughout the months-long application and review process. Now, I also want to share that we're looking for strong scientists with solid expertise in their field and for their career stage. We're also looking for some of these other characteristics. Leadership potential, that's maturity, good judgment, and initiative, communication and outreach skills, especially to non-scientific audiences, problem-solving abilities, and commitment to the fellowship objectives of flexibility, professional growth, and public service. All right, the purpose of this chat is for you, our guests, to chat with our fellows. And to that end, you can submit your questions via chat at any time by clicking the question box in your menu and typing your question there. We already see questions coming in, so thank you for those. In your message, you can indicate the person or people to whom the question is directed if appropriate. And during today's chat, we'll focus our questions on the application and interview process, which is our chat theme. And we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Questions outside of the chat topic or theme might be answered via chat box instead. Okay, let's do a proper introduction to the fellows who are joining us today. Dr. Antoinette Nelson is a current fellow at the U.S. Agency for International Development, Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, and will be spending her second year as a fellow in the USAID Office of HIV/AIDS. Dr. Allison Truhlar is a current fellow as well in the Department of Energy, in the Office of the Deputy Director for Science Programs and Office of Workforce Development for Teachers and Scientists. Dr. Aubrey Paris is the IEEE USA Congressional Science and Engineering Diplomacy Fellow, working in the State Department's Office of Science and Technology, of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. So thank you all for joining us today. Before I go into questions from the audience, I'll kick it off with one from myself. If you could go back in time, what one piece of advice would you give yourself when applying to the fellowship? And Antoinette, I'm wondering if you can kick us off.
Hey, hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good. All right. Yeah, glad to be here to chat with you all. If I could go back in time, let me see. So I finished my PhD in 2018 in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Rutgers. And then I started the fellowship in 2019. So I call it a revitalization year in between. And in that time, I did some fun stuff and then also some stuff related to pursuing a career in science policy. So that included spending some time doing a congressional internship program on Capitol Hill with the Senate Budget Committee and the current ranking member, Senator Bernie Sanders, and working on a variety of different topics and policy areas. So for me, during that experience and that time, if I would have known, I think earlier, that there were opportunities to apply for AAAS through the other societies that offer the ability to apply without you having your PhD in hand. So I could have started that process earlier. That's something I would have considered. So Aubrey can probably talk about that because she came in through that route. So that's something that I wish I understood earlier. Additionally, I wish I also had a deeper understanding of what it meant to really be involved in policy work. So when I thought of science policy, I really just thought about just what we were usually getting like in our emails. So I was part of AAAS, like a member. So things that were always coming in were, issues that dealt with like climate change, funding issues. So dealing with NSF and NIH kind of angles. Yes, I didn't know like how broad science policy could really be and just how much a lot of the work that I was already doing, like in my community and my extracurricular activities, was really directly related to policy. So, I mean, we can get into that. And that's something I really do want to stress, that policy is not just this very like narrow path that you had to be working with like a legislator or something like that. But policy is really broad, and just thinking about like greater impacts to society and America and the nation and globally, really. So yeah, I just wish I kind of understood those more. I might have adjusted a little bit of how I tailored my plans leading up to the fellowship. I think everything worked out okay, but I wish I did know those earlier.
Thank you for sharing that. I heard a lot of good tips that I was nodding along to, and I imagine our audience was too. And Aubrey, are you willing to jump in and maybe share next?
Absolutely. So like Antoinette mentioned, I came in through a partner society, IEEE USA, but I would also just quickly introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Aubrey. My background is in chemistry and material science, but I was able to enter the fellowship process through an engineering society. And so one of the things that I learned very quickly when doing my research of how to become a fellow was that you'd be surprised how many partner societies you might be eligible to apply through. As a chemist, I was going through applications for probably 7 different partner societies, and only one of them was directly chemistry by name. I went the route of partner society, again, as Antoinette mentioned, because I wanted to begin a fellowship directly out of my PhD program. So I graduated with my PhD spring of 2019, yeah, basically a year ago, and wanted to begin the policy fellowship that fall. And one of the differences that I noticed was that in the AAAS direct route, you need to have your PhD in hand by the time you submit your application. For the partner societies, at least the 7-ish that I applied to, you just needed to have an assurance that you would have your PhD in hand by the time your fellowship started. And so that was something that I think is really important to know, maybe for some of you out there who are saying, yes, I'd love to apply, but not in 2020. Something to keep in mind if you didn't know that was a possibility. But more broadly, in terms of what I would go back and tell myself during the application process, to go back to Jessica's question, something that I learned very quickly, and I wish I had spent more time on, I think, was be doing a little bit of research on the different offices or bureaus within the agencies that I might be interested in working in, because it's not something that's binding. It's not like saying, oh, I'm interested in working in this State Department bureau in this specific office. It's not something that's going to keep you stuck in that spot, but it shows a level of initiative that you really want this. You've thought about where you would play a key role, maybe even know a little bit about the projects those offices do. That can be a really nice supplement to an application or an interview.
Thank you for jumping all that, Aubrey. Yeah, and please go ahead, Allison.
Sure. So hi, I'm Allison Truhlar. My background is in environmental engineering. I got my PhD in summer 2017, and actually at the time had heard of the program, but didn't necessarily think it was for me. I think similar to what Antoinette was saying, I thought of science policy as a very narrow thing. I envision this fellowship as like everyone working on the Hill, and if you didn't know about making legislation, you were never going to get it. So I had a friend who mentioned it around the time I was graduating from my PhD, and I kind of had it in the back of my head, and it wasn't until a couple years later that I actually went forward and applied. And I think what Antoinette was saying, realizing that a lot of what I was already doing, I was very interested in educational outreach. I worked in a postdoc that had a lot of direct connections working with the community. So that sort of component is skills that directly would transfer into working in a number of these different positions through AAAS. But my advice that I initially thought of when Jessica asked the question, I would have encouraged myself to reach out sooner to more current or former fellows. There was one professor where I did my graduate work who had received a congressional fellowship, and I emailed him, and he was just incredibly helpful, offered to read my essay, talked to me before my interview. I truly feel like he was very instrumental in helping me navigate through the fellowship application process. And I think, I had seen a couple of graduates from my school who were past fellows, but I was nervous to reach out to them. But now, being a fellow myself, and I think speaking for myself and I venture for the others on this call, that we're eager to help. And I think I would encourage all of you, if you're considering it, to reach out either through your networks, or if that's not possible, I think many fellows, and you could start with ones who participate in these sort of outreach events, would be eager to help even without knowing you.
Thank you all. What a wonderful kickoff to the conversation. I was just jotting down a lot of tips that I heard, and so I want to just share them back here. So I heard kind of spend the time understanding how broad science policy really can be. It's science policy, it's science and communication, it's science and society. There's so many intersection of how your work and what you care about and what you're passionate about in your research and how it's intersecting with the world. And that often there's a lot of transferable skills and experiences that you're building right now that you may not even realize are applicable to a fellowship placement. And then spend some time also connecting to that science policy network. There might be folks at your alma mater, at your current school, who are part of other clubs, or the fellows who are on this call right now, who can be a resource to you to share their experiences and maybe assist or support as you go through the application process as well. And I'm so glad that we have Aubrey on, because she's able to share more about one of the partner societies and her perspective. And yes, I can confirm that for AAAS, you do need that degree completed at the time that you apply by the application deadline. But for many of our 30 partner societies, there's flexibility and different eligibility criteria, and many allow you to apply while you're completing. And so you can apply to as many as you are eligible and able. Aubrey said she did 7. Wow. Yeah. And you can also apply through AAAS if you're also eligible at the same time, so they're not mutually exclusive. And so there are lots of opportunities for you to consider. And so we also heard that some of you applied kind of right out of graduate school or even during graduate school. And Allison, you said you took a couple of years before you applied. But for each of you, I'd love to hear your thoughts about when you did kind of settle down to deciding you were going to apply and starting, what do you think was something you did to make your application competitive? And Allison, I'm wondering if you can start us off.
Sure. I think one thing that you mentioned, Jessica, when you were kind of summing up some of the earlier tips that I think is really key is that idea of transferable skills. So, looking back over my application materials in my essay, trying to translate everything I was doing in my PhD, but take out the technical bits and instead talk about, project management or, working with a community group. So translating science to other audiences, non-scientific audiences. Another thing that I emphasized was flexibility and ability to learn quickly. That's something that, I think any position you're placed in will hope that you're able to do, and it's something that we learn a lot of during our PhD. So I think that would be my main piece of advice for the application materials in particular, is just trying to think about things in terms of not the technical piece, which is what I think we're used to thinking about a lot of, being trained as scientists, but more about what are those underlying skills that you are doing that can be applied in other situations. And I think once you start looking for them, there are a ton. You do a ton just in your PhD, even if you didn't do anything outside of that.
And Alison, are you willing to maybe throw out a few specifics? I can hear people like pencils jotting down the tips now.
Sure. Well, so I named several. So I know for like flexibility, kind of being able to pivot. So for example, during my PhD, I was doing research on E. coli in agricultural soils. And, I had planned out sort of a 3-year progression of these are the 3 chapters for my dissertation and the 3 experiments that are going to happen. But 2 experiments in, we had a negative result. So couldn't go forward with the 3rd experiment. So being able to adapt to that situation and pivot, the example I gave was I was a TA at the time for a large online class. So I was interested in doing some educational research. I got some training through my university. They had a Center for Teaching Excellence that I was already participating in their workshops. So I got more training to learn how to do educational research and worked with a researcher there to help me introduce some different interventions into my online class and evaluate how well they were working. So that was, an ability to kind of reach a setback, but then find an opportunity out of that, learn new skills quickly to move forward with that. I would also say I talked about that class as an example of evaluation skills. So if you're working in a program office, they might be interested in you being able to evaluate how well different programs are working. So that's another skill you could highlight. And yeah, I'm just thinking about my earlier research. That was an interdisciplinary team. I was working across different colleges within my university from folks from different departments, coordinating all their schedules to get this research done. So, and that was all just within the PhD, not thinking outside to the extracurriculars, which, as Antoinette said earlier, are another, gold mine of different transferable skills.
Thank you so much, Allison. Antoinette, I wonder if you're willing to share a little bit about how you think you made your application competitive.
Yeah. So, well, ditto to everything Allison was saying in the broad skills. Some things I would just add to that. So for the way I approached my application was I really wanted to tell basically a holistic story. So I wanted to use, during the time that I applied, you can correct me if the application process has changed at all, but we had the personal statement, a statement that involved our extracurricular activities, obviously our resume, CV, then we had the recommendation letters, and then our bio. I think those were all the parts. So I really thought, how could I have all of these parts tell a different angle of the same story? So in my case, the work that I was doing in graduate school was HIV prevention. And the work that I wanted to do in the fellowship was in the space of international development and global health. So speaking from the science perspective, so I use my personal statement to talk more about my science background, thinking of it in 2 parts, and going through the process now and actually being a fellow and sitting on the other side as well. Something I'll also add is to thinking of it in 2 parts. So one is your application has to get through AAAS to become a tentative fellow. And then when you're later on in the process, you go through a series of interviews within the agencies, and they're using your application package to initially seek out interested incoming fellows to their offices and to teams. So thinking of it as a personal statement, much like many of the other personal statements you'd write for other fellowships, but also thinking a little bit like a cover letter. So a little bit of what kind of skills can you bring. So I use my personal statement, as I mentioned, to talk about my experience specifically in the space of HIV prevention, other science-related activities that I had done internationally. So I was also an NSF East Asian Pacific Summer Institutes Fellow, where you spend a summer in a country abroad working on collaborative research initiatives and projects. So I'd spent my time in China. So I talked about how that related to various interests and like access to resources, access to educational like material and capital, depending on where you were, but relating that all back to my interest in international development. And then for my extracurricular activities, I had a number of, as I mentioned, I was really involved like in my community, both on campus and in the broader community. So I talked a lot about those individual activities, the leadership roles that I participated in within those, different programs that maybe whether I had initiated them or had a leadership part in the development of the program and activity. I highlighted those in my extracurricular activities. Once again, for me, it was telling the same story that I was passionate about, global health equity, social justice, and all of these things that tied again with other principles that I'd written in my personal statement. And I similarly, when I chose, which we may talk about later, but when I was choosing my references for recommendation letters, I thought similarly as well. So of the different parts of who I am that I wanted to come across in my application package, what different people could speak to those different parts of me that once again tell the same story, but from a different angle, and to highlight the different experiences that I had. So I think that was part of what made my application strong. For me, some of the overlap was a little bit obvious. For example, I did HIV prevention work. So then the work that I had done that I wanted to do in international development, I'm also first generation Jamaican American. I lived in Jamaica for some time, and so I've done a lot of activities in Jamaica. So it was a little bit maybe straightforward in that sense, the connection. But I think in a lot of our work, there are definitely ways that you could find those linkages to help create a story. And then the last point related to the fact that I think of it in two parts. So first, the fellowship part, and then also, so AAAS, and then also your agencies. I would suggest, similar to, as Aubrey mentioned earlier, having an idea of where you would want to serve during the fellowship and making sure that like that's not written in stone, right? So that you're still open, but that you have put some thought into it. And when you're writing your statement, I would highlight the importance of using like certain keywords and buzzwords of that specific sector or area that you're interested in. I think that helps later on in the process as well. As I mentioned, these materials, the agencies will also be looking through them. So that helps them to find you, for you to find them, and for those matches to be made.
Well, thank you, Antoinette. That is fantastic. And I think, yeah, you covered all of the different parts of the AAAS application, the CV, your background, the writing prompts, essays, your references. And Aubrey, I'm wondering if as you share your reflections on your application, if you could highlight any differences or similarities from what Allison or Antoinette have shared, just because you were applying to a different scientific society.
Totally. And I've got to say, Allison and Antoinette, you really did a thorough job in covering major tips, because I would echo the same sentiments. In terms of differences in the application and interview process, there are some, and of course, each partner society's application and interview process is a little bit different. But for example, on the IEEE front, we had what was, I think, a 6-part application. It included most of the components that you all have already talked about. Your personal statement, which was just like a letter of intent. It was just a slightly different format. Your CV, obviously, and your reference letters. I think we were required 3 and allowed more than that. I remember having 4. There was, for me, a letter had to be provided by my PhD advisor saying that he intended for me to be done my PhD in time to start the fellowship. But you know, standard components for the actual application. And I think where some more of the differences come up where it would be actually in the interview process. So IEEE has basically a review board for the fellowship applications, and they whittle them down to finalists. Those finalists are asked to write a policy memo, which we can talk more about, because I believe that's replicated in the AAAS process. And then your interview, if you are selected as a finalist, in normal circumstances is in person. So they will ship you out to DC and set you up with a 1-hour interview with what's effectively a panel of people. It was one of the most intense interview experiences I've had in my life because I've never experienced something like that before, where you're sort of at a boardroom style table, you're sitting at one end and there are about 8 people sitting around the table with their little name placards and their packets, which are it's your application, in front of them. And for me, I actually really ended up enjoying the interview process. I love talking to people, so it was nice and conversational. But after that, I was notified within 24 hours that I had received the finalist position. So by the time placement week happens for AAAS, where the partner societies are invited to partake if they're interested or if the fellows want to, I was already the IEEE fellow, which made my placement week experience a little bit different than the AAAS folks for many reasons. Since we're talking about differences, I'll highlight a couple of them here. So placement week, of course, is when finalists are invited, again, under normal circumstances, to DC to complete in-person interviews with offices around the federal government that are seeking to fill a position in their office with a fellow. So these openings are, as Jessica mentioned, all across the board in terms of different agencies or different congressional offices if you're going that route. And for me, the IEEE fellowship position, you are earmarked for the State Department. Similar for the AIP, American Institute of Physics, executive branch fellowship, also earmarks to the State Department. And so it was interesting for me because while many of my AAAS finalist counterparts are running all over the city, doing their interviews at many agencies, I was just going back and forth from my hotel to the Harry Truman building and did all of my interviews in the State Department. So that was pretty cool. And I think placement week is a whole other conversation that's really fun to have. But I guess to wrap up my response, I would just say when it comes to keeping your application competitive, definitely practice what you preach in the application and interview process. If you're saying that you are really strong in science communication, show that. You know, you don't need to prove that you're smart. The people reviewing your application know that. You've proven that already just by nature of what you've been studying and the fact that you have or are receiving a PhD. So don't try to prove that you're smart by using all the jargon in the sciences, because the people reviewing your application most of the time aren't going to know what you're talking about. So show that you can talk about science to a non-scientific audience. As Allison said, demonstrate that flexibility or whatever skill you're talking about with short anecdotes, and keep it all on your CV. There are things that you've done in your past, maybe as far away as undergrad or even high school, that will be worth mentioning, and if they're on your CV are going to catch people's attention. And I'd be happy to talk more about later on the fact that in every interview I had, whether in the finalist selection process or placement week, I didn't talk about my research at all. No one asked about it. What they asked about was everything on my CV that had those transferable skills. My podcasting, my work with a science policy think tank, an entrepreneurial experience I had in college. So all of that's really valuable.
Wow, thank you all. I'm just taking so many notes. This is such good advice. And I wonder, did any of you apply to any of the other branches in addition to the executive branch? So I know you're all in executive branch agencies, but at least through AAAS, you can apply to legislative or judicial or Revell simultaneously.
I did. Yeah, so a lot of the partner society fellowships are congressional. And so I did apply to several of those. In most cases, the application process and even the interview process is very similar. It's once you get to the placement week where things start to diverge, and I wouldn't want to talk too much about that since I don't know from experience, but the application and interview process is fairly similar. You would want to tailor that application to the fact that you recognize legislative and executive branch are different, and what you might want to do in one place versus the other. But something that I think is also important to note, and I'll mention because I had experience with it, is the fact that if you're applying through several different societies, even if AAAS is one of them, the timelines of when you hear about getting an interview or receiving an offer and things like that can be really different. So, I was still hearing back about getting finalist interviews from some of my societies after I had already been offered the position for my AAA. And at some point, you just have to hedge your bets or make a judgment call and pull the trigger and either accept or decline an offer in order to continue pursuing other ones. So the timelines are all very different. And so one of the reasons I ended up in the executive branch was a combination of the fact that I think it was a better fit for me anyway, but also it was one of the first offers I got.
Thank you for that context. Yeah, and I think you're spot on in saying, I know through AAAS you can apply to 2 of the 4 program areas that are available this year. And something that you and Antoinette have really made clear is to customize your entire application package, especially your essays, to those program areas, highlighting the parts of your experiences, your transferable skills, extracurricular activities that align with that branch and your interest in it, and why being a fellow in that program area is the right next step for you in your career. And so you might have, a very similar, it's you and your one background, but you can frame it and tell your story to 2 different audiences, and we strongly encourage that. So for instance, with Antoinette, she had experience through another policy fellowship on the Hill. So if she had decided to apply to the legislative branch, that would have been a great thing for her to highlight. But I'm sure she highlighted other experience with policy and science communication as well, since she was really focusing in on global health and international development for executive branch agencies. All right, so let's see, thinking about the application process, let's pretend we've all submitted our application materials. It's November 1st. That was great, successful. When you hear back from AAAS, if you are invited to the next phase, that's a virtual interview. And when you're invited to that, you're also asked to write a policy memo. So you come to that interview having written a policy memo and presenting on it. And Aubrey, I'm not sure if you had something similar with IEEE, and if you could all maybe speak about that experience and especially that policy memo. Antoinette, could you maybe share your experiences? And I can't hear you, but it might be on my end.
There you go. I'm here now. Okay. So the policy memo, I feel like that's a part that kind of scares a lot of people, and partly because, I mean, you wouldn't really have experience doing that coming from research unless you've had specific like legislative type experience. So, I mean, fortunately for me, during that time, I was on the Hill. And so I had already been writing memos in the office that I was working in. So I had an idea somewhat of what was useful that I was able to build upon. But I would say, I think for me, what helped with that process was, as I think both of the other panelists mentioned, the importance of networking, speaking with other fellows, and using the resources that you have around you. So so even though I had experience like writing memos, within the space of what the different options were for us to research and create the memo focused on, I had not written those in those type of areas before. So I was able to also to have the air of other fellows who'd gone through the process to hear how they'd also shape their memos, and I think that was helpful. Yeah, I think it's just a matter of being able to write clearly, concisely. I think you have a page to include all the information, to make sure that you are writing from a perspective that is built on evidence and not personal feelings. So some of the prompts can be things that we may have personal feelings towards, but the point of that I thought the point of the memo was really to make sure that we could make evidence-based decisions and recommendations to policymakers, to help them make their decisions. So so being concise, making sure it's evidence-based, and then also of the prompts, I would say sometimes I know sometimes there's like a desire to kind of do what might be the most flashy prompt. Like maybe you look at something and it has like a portion that seems like it's really creative. And I know some people are like, okay, let me do this. Let me show my creativity and go for it, which is okay. But it's also okay to do something in an area that maybe you've already had some general experience in, so you're not like recreating the wheel as well. I know that the memo cannot be related to what your dissertation work was on, but like for me, my memo was related to some of the work that I had done in the broadening participation in STEM space. So it came from personal experiences that I had, but I was able to use evidence and research to shape that policy. So I think a lot of around the area answers, but hope that's helpful.
It is, and you shared some context as well, which is when you're invited to write these policy memos, there's usually some guidance provided, and it's often different essay prompts from year to year. There's often a request not to focus on a topic that's within your wheelhouse, and some of those things that you pointed out to make it more challenging potentially, and to really think about your process that you're using. Allison, since you also went through the AAAS process, what was your experience like with the memo, and any tips?
Sure. So I think Antoinette, definitely everything she's covered, I also agree with. And especially the networking piece, as I had also mentioned earlier, reaching out to that professor who had done a congressional fellowship, he was able to give me some tips from the perspective of that program, which I think now that I've gone through the process and also heard his advice, there were some slight differences. But one piece of advice he gave me that was very helpful was to structure my memo in, I think it's called the pyramid principle. And you can look that up, but I found it just as a useful tool for, as Antoinette said, you only have a page and you have to get your point across and you have to make it very clearly. And you also have to give a 5-minute briefing on your memo at the start of your interview. So I found the pyramid principle to be a useful way of structuring both my memo and how I made my oral briefing during the interview. I would also say get people to read your memo over, even if they're just family or friends, check it for typos and whatnot. And another piece of advice that I got from a friend who was working at the time in a federal agency, and that we've learned since in AAAS, is the principle of the bottom line up front, or the bluff. So that was how I started out the memo and proceeded on from there. I think also picking a topic that you're interested in. I went similarly with a topic in broadening participation in STEM, since I am interested in STEM education, and trying to keep it simple. You're asked to give a recommendation at the end of the memo you're pretending you're giving it, oftentimes I think to your office head or director of your agency, depending on the scenario, and don't feel like you have to give a far-reaching recommendation. I think trying to set boundaries on what you're working on and give a recommendation that you can defend with the evidence that you found in the week or two that you get to write the memo, which isn't a lot of time, especially when it's not an area of your expertise. So it's okay to kind of draw some boundaries for yourself within the prompt, I think, and carve out a narrower scope so that you can make a recommendation that you feel you can defend and also research in that time period.
If I could chime in really quick,
Yeah.
I think the recommendation is also a really key part of the memo that many people might not realize. I've been told after the fact that you can really be assessed on the breadth of the recommendation. If you go to your point of not being too far reaching in the recommendation, you can demonstrate what you do or do not understand about the policy world and how things work based on what you say in that recommendation. So for example, if you are going all pie in the sky in an ideal world, you know, these are all the things we want to do about this topic, but that's clearly not realistic, that's not a good thing. It doesn't look good. It shows that maybe you aren't fit right now for this type of position. And I've been told that's something that people do look at. So just keep that in mind. And in terms of the recommendation also, this is just another place where it's good to have a little bit of background in terms of what different offices and bureaus and agencies do. If you can say, you know, in the background part or the context part of your memo that a particular office did XYZ on this topic before, and so now you're recommending that that office do ABC, again, it's just another subtle indication that you've put in the time, the effort, and are thinking about how things work in the real world and not just in fantasy fake memo land. And while I'm speaking, I'll also point out that this is another area where there's slight differences between the partner societies and AAAS. So IEEE and AIP, since you know I spoke about doing that one as well, they both have a memo requirement, and they're a little different. They're a little different from each other. But even just IEEE specifically, we didn't really have any guidelines. We were not given prompts. It was write a briefing memo on any topic that you want at the intersection of science and policy. So my God, I was a little overwhelmed because that's a lot of stuff you could talk about. So there was no real guidelines or template, no prompt, and we had 72 hours to write it and turn it back in. Just that was meant to sort of emulate the fast-paced environment that you would be working in if you're in one of these agencies. So everything's a little different, but the goals of the task, I think, are still the same, to demonstrate your ability to put together an informational piece, speaking to policymakers, not scientists, providing a recommendation, being concise, and showing your writing skills.
And now the follow-up question for you all is, you went through that exercise as part of the interview process. Has there been a time in your fellowship thus far where you've really applied those skills for either the written or oral briefing in your day-to-day work?
I've written memos. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'll say some parts of those overlapped a little bit, but I work a lot in the programming space, much more than policy, I guess, with memo writing. So yeah, I haven't had to do too much related to that.
Yeah, similar for me. Currently, I work in a program office, so I don't write memos, but I will say that, not to sound like I'm plugging this pyramid principle, but that framework has been helpful for me in terms of breaking me out of my tendency to try to like show people a ton of data and then tell them the point, because the pyramid principle inverts that, and you're supposed to tell people the point or the recommendation and then give them all the data, which is not at all what I've done for most of my life. So that was helpful to learn.
Great. Yeah, I feel like the bottom line up front and the pyramid scheme, like just all of these are really good practices that you can apply in your workplace and really anywhere in your communication. So thank you all for sharing all of that insight into the policy memo and into the interview process. I wonder maybe if you all could share a little bit more about if there was a component of your application that you believe really positioned you to be successful, maybe a portion of your application that you're still proud of to this day. Anything come to mind, Allison?
In terms of a component I think made me successful, I guess I wouldn't say it was any particular component in and of itself, but I do think when Antoinette was talking about having a cohesive story, a cohesive package to your application, I do think that I had a few key messages that I wanted every part of my application to speak to, and that I reiterated again during the interview component. So just talking about how I felt that, you know, my values of enjoying working in mission-driven teams and doing things that serve the greater good, and then coupled with my skills that I demonstrated through, you know, those transferable skills that I demonstrated through the essay and during the interview, really made me a good fit for this fellowship. And I think also being very clear that a lot of my purpose was just to see whether the government was a good fit. I was looking for a good fit for those values and those skills, and I saw the government as a potential option, and I saw this fellowship as a way to explore that. So I think just being consistent with those messages and demonstrating them in every part of the application, and then trying to draw them through in the interview as well, I think was what I did to make the application strong.
Thank you. And Aubrey, I saw you nodding along, and I know you wrote many applications, so I'm wondering if there's anything that you're really proud of in them.
Honestly, I think I'm just proud of the journey I put together prior to applying to the fellowship. I mean, I think we've all talked a bit about different experiences we've had outside of the lab. That was something that, you know, I don't want to speak for everyone who's on the panel / also listening in, but I think it's really easy to be in graduate school in the sciences and try to do things outside of the lab and really be criticized for that. And not always by your mentors, sometimes by your peers. And that can be really disheartening. But if, you know, pushing forward and doing the other stuff anyway, I think we are all really great examples of why doing that is so important and can get you to the next step, especially when that next step is non-traditional, right, for a scientist entering the policy world. So just being able to look past any criticisms or judgments, especially for people who are still doing their degrees, it is worth it. And you should keep doing what brings you that passion and that excitement, because whether it's this fellowship or something else career-wise in the future, you will find ways to make that time worth it, and that criticism, which shouldn't even exist, be worth it.
Yeah. And I just want to clap for that point, Aubrey, because I think that is so important. Because there is a culture in academia, at least in my experience, that it can sometimes be a little bit frowned upon when we're involved in things outside of the lab. But I think that those were definitely, in my own experience, the things that made me stand out in my application. It showed like a long-term commitment to certain passions that I had, and I think, and all the fellows that I know, there's so many of us, but everyone that I know is extremely passionate and dynamic and really like thoughtful and dedicated to one or various kinds of missions, just very dynamic people. So I really, I echo everything that you just said. And I'm trying to remember, what was the original question, because I had a point to that.
I think you were getting at what you feel made your application unique, or that you're maybe most proud of.
Okay, yeah. So, and just quickly to that, so I did I went through pieces of the application process twice, since I'm doing a second placement for my second year. And something that I'm proud of, and that I think is good to mention, which was loosely mentioned before, but just to reiterate, for me, I was very focused each time. Might not have looked like it on paper, but I was strategic in how I wrote my applications, because I personally knew where I wanted to work. I personally decided to apply to AAAS because I was passionate about international development. I was passionate about global health. I wanted to start building a career that when I woke up every morning, that I was excited to go into work. And so when I wrote my applications, both times, I knew the specific agency, I knew the offices that I was interested in, and I used language that really like screamed at those offices. So for example, right now I work in the Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. I didn't even realize it until later when I looked back in my application, and those words are definitely in there. A lot of the, once again, telling a full story from my personal statement to my extracurricular activities, they were screaming, I want to do this work. So that was my first year. And then when I submitted my applications again, pieces of it for my second round placement, it was really focused on wanting to get back into the HIV space and use my work from graduate school with my current experience in gender equality, and now applying that in the policy space. And now I'm going to the Office of HIV/AIDS, working in that space. So I think while being open and flexible, but also putting in those keywords, if you do know where you would like to be, I think that was good. And I'm proud of that kind of like strategic way of navigating it, because I ended up in the offices that I'm really interested in.
Oh, those are all such great ideas, great suggestions. And I really love that there's this emphasis on everybody who's listening in is a unique individual with something that they are passionate about. There's a reason why you came and spent an hour with us today, and kind of remind yourself of that, keep that in your heart, and use that as a motivation for you as you move forward in this process and as you explore this fellowship and really all of your options in your career. So unfortunately, it seems like we're approaching the end of the hour and our time together. So I want to wrap up by asking one more piece of parting advice. Maybe this is a speed round for us, our elevator pitch. If looking back now that you've gone through the application and interview process, you're a fellow, is there a component of the application that you think is overlooked by applicants, but maybe really important to reviewers? And Aubrey, are you willing to, anything come to mind?
Sure. I think in the application and interview process, you're given a lot of freedom to talk about what you want to talk about. And I think a part that, especially as scientists, you're not often trained to talk about is your story. You know, what got you to this point that you're interested in doing this, and why? And I think while it's not a formal component of what you must write about in, say, a personal statement or a letter of intent, I think it's something that people pay attention to for a couple of reasons. It shows that you can communicate and you're not a robot. Common misconception, I'm not sure if you're all aware, but people think scientists are a little robotic sometimes. So show that you have a personality and a backstory, and show that there's a reason that you're doing this, not just because you weren't sure what to do next, so you're going to do this. So I think your story can be used very strategically to send a message, whatever that message is that you want to be conveying to your reviewers.
Thanks, Aubrey. Antoinette?
Yeah, I think, that is probably the advice that I would give. I think she hit it right on the nail. As mentioned before, fellows in general are just extremely dynamic people who are amazing scientists and just, well-rounded in a broad variety of areas. So I would just emphasize that when you're writing your application, that you really shine a light on all the things that you do and the skills that you have that are related to the issues that you really care about, and the issues and the passions you have that make you, like how are you different from everyone else? And of course within a professional capacity, but how are you trying to make your career and the work that you do, how are you trying to have an impact and affect lives that are broader than you? So I would just, advise, as was said before, to really channel that and show it. And one quick point, might be good to also look at USA jobs in general. I think making an account, looking through agencies, seeing different positions that are available there as well, whether for the future or even current, just an idea of the responsibilities and the work that people do in government is helpful to get an idea of what you can do with your skills and talents.
And I'll just say everything Aubrey and Antoinette said, and I would just add, at the end of my virtual interview, they asked for a 30-second elevator pitch. Why should we pick you for this fellowship? And I think if you go into your essay, go into every part of your application thinking about that, it'll help to really focus you. And again, it's, I didn't know exactly where I wanted to go, but whatever you're passionate about and is motivating you, that's enough reason to, have a reason to be applying to this and be selected for it as well.
Thank you all, and that brings us to the end of our time together. I want to thank you, Antoinette, Aubrey, Allison, again. Thank you to our audience for joining. The application's open now through November 1st, and I hope you enjoyed us for our next chat, which is going to focus on the application and the 4 program areas. It's going to be on July 16th, and it will feature 4 fellows, each representing a different program area, so you don't want to miss it. And if we didn't answer your questions today, please do send us an email at fellowships@AAAS.org, shown on the slide. Thank you all again. Have a good day.